The Road to Autonomy is presented by the Road to Autonomy Index. The Road to Autonomy Index is a rules-based equity benchmark index that measures the performance of a basket of global companies that are involved in the development and commercialization of autonomy. Institutional investors and fund managers are watching megatrends that are shaping investment opportunities today. These megatrends are creating thematic investment ideas and opportunities for forward-thinking investors. We believe that one of the biggest megatrends today is autonomy. That's why we created the Road to Autonomy Index, the world's first and only pure-play index to track the thematic investment opportunity in autonomy. Follow the Road to Autonomy Index on your favorite finance app by simply typing in the ticker Autonomy. To learn more about the Road to Autonomy Index, visit roadtoautonomy.com/index. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome Stefan Heck, founder and CEO NAUTO. Stefan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here because plain and simple, NAUTO's saving lives. Your AI software is doing really good by saving lives. You're helping to defeat this pandemic, which is known as distracted driving. But before we get into that, I want to go in the Wayback Machine. In 2015, you founded NAUTO. What did you see in the market then? Did you see the rise of distracted driving or what did you see?
Yeah, it's an interesting beginning, actually. So I was a professor at Stanford during that time, teaching about disruptive technologies and looking a lot at the things that were disrupting vehicles at that time, and still to this day, actually. Electrification, battery technology was improving. A lot more people are now looking at electric vehicles because they have fewer emissions. They're more efficient to drive, and in some cases also more fun. If you've ever driven an electric van, it's actually surprisingly perky compared to a traditional van. The second thing I was looking at was how do you improve safety? And you may remember 2015 timeframe, there were a few handful of companies working on autonomy then. The Google X project that turned into Waymo, Cruise, which got acquired by General Motors. So it's just beginning. But the inspiration for what we did came from two pieces. The first was kind of very brainy and analytical, which is I looked at the collision rates and realized that a lot of collisions are very, very rare. So I became convinced it would take a long time to really perfect autonomous driving. It's easy to get the sort of 80% ordinary driving right. It's very hard to get the last 3 or 4% of difficult circumstances right. And so that's why I looked at NAUTO as a way to work with the human driver rather than replacing them, so that you could operate safely anywhere immediately, relying on the human driver to solve the rare edge cases, the really unusual kid jumps and interacts with a dog and so forth, that are really hard for AI to understand. But yet improve all of the obvious things that AI can help with. But the second thing for distraction specifically was I was biking to campus. Twice a week, somebody would nearly run me over. I started logging just what was going on when they almost hit me. And they were all forms of distraction. Looking at their iPad, working their mobile phone, eating breakfast, combing their hair, reading newspapers, reading books, crazy stuff that people do, watching Netflix. And I started looking at the government data. There's a great federal crash database. There's a California one. And they basically said the biggest problem we have in the country is speeding, followed by drunk driving. And I was like, this can't be. And now we know, 8 years later, the biggest problem by far is, as you said, the epidemic of distracted driving. The cell phones that we all have in our pocket have made that dramatically worse. Drivers were always distracted, but we're seeing distraction rise hundreds of %. And it is literally the top cause of collisions across all our fleets. There's nothing as dangerous as distracted driving.
If you just, say you're going to the grocery store or you're going to a friend's house or you're going out to dinner, I guarantee you're going to see at least one person on their phone during that journey. You're probably going to see multiple people on their phones during that journey. What does the NAUTO system do to prevent the driver in a fleet operation from getting distracted? Is it beeping? What does it do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll actually give you the data. On average, if you're a commercial driver, we see that you're distracted 7 times per driving hour, roughly every 9 minutes. If you're driving on the road and you see teenagers, it's probably a lot worse than that. But these are professional drivers that are still looking at their phone more often than every 10 minutes. Now, what we do in those situations is actually highly variable. If you look down at your phone in a relatively innocuous moment, let's say you're stopped at a red light, you glance down at your phone to check directions or look at that text that you just got. It's illegal in most states. You're not supposed to hold your phone and look at your phone at all, even while stopped at a red light. But NAUTO actually does nothing in that situation because your risk is really small. It's not zero. You increase your risk of getting rear-ended because the person behind you sees the light change to green, assumes you're going to go, and winds up rear-ending you. So you don't want to be in that situation either, but you're not going to be at fault. It's not going to be as high a risk. Take the more common situation. You're driving along on the freeway and you're kind of bored and you glance down at your phone. If you do it for a brief moment, like checking your map, how far is the exit? Again, we'll allow that, assuming there's nobody in front of you. But once you start crossing about 2 seconds, we'll start intervening. The first thing is very gentle behavioral nudges. It's literally it's like a little reminder, that little subconscious voice saying you shouldn't be doing that. And if you stop, great, that's done. That's all there is. In commercial vehicles, your boss will never know because you self-corrected. Now, if you keep doing it, it will escalate. So the highest risk we see is if you're doing it for longer than 6 seconds at faster than 35 miles per hour. Turns out to be the number one cause of collision in all our fleets. So please don't look at your phone for longer than 6 seconds if you're driving on a highway. You've gone a football field without looking at the road. And that's where we see full speed crashes into other vehicles. You're literally not seeing what you're going to hit. So you don't get a chance to brake. You don't get a chance to swerve. That's where you'll get voice feedback. It'll say, pull over to use your phone. And it'll give you corrective feedback and coaching. Now, let's take the worst case scenario. You're looking down at your phone, reading that email from your friend, and there's a traffic jam up ahead. The vehicles are all braking. Now it's no longer just a distraction situation. It's an imminent collision. In that case, we're going to sound an all-out alarm, and you're going to look up. You're going to have those big, wide eyes and go, oh, imagine the second word. And you're going to be incredibly grateful. And we see that. We see drivers, after they use the 4-letter word, they smile, they wave, even though no one's watching, they actually wave to the NAUTO system because they're grateful. And we look for that expression of gratitude because it means that you've learned. And if you've had 1 or 2 of those experiences, you will not look at your phone anymore. Maybe not forever, but not for a long time. And we see that within the first week of using NAUTO, about 80% of all the distractions and nearly 100% of all these severe long distractions are eliminated. It's a very powerful tool. It's basically working by reminding you, hey, this was a big risk you're taking, and creating what I call these oh shit moments where you look up and say, oh my God, that was dangerous.
Is it self-correcting coaching where they say, whoa, I potentially saved my life? Or is it the fleet manager, somebody back at dispatch that's saying, hey, don't do this? What drives that behavioral change?
So that's very different for NAUTO versus other video telematics systems that are more traditional technologies. For video telematics, it's the supervisor coaching when you get back to base. For us, it's mostly the driver self-correcting. We see that 80 to 90% of the drivers automatically drop their risk behaviors because they realize, oh, that was dangerous. Again, it's all about surfacing the things you do and making you aware just how dangerous that moment was. We find that there's a very small percentage of drivers that don't self-correct. Sometimes that can actually be a deeper underlying issue. They may need glasses. They may have sleep apnea and they're falling asleep while driving. Obviously, those are things you can't fix through just AI feedback and voice feedback. Those do then get surfaced for the fleet manager to say, hey, let's get you to a doctor and have you checked. But all the normal behavior risks, which is the vast majority of what causes collisions, the drivers are empowered to self-correct and change that themselves.
Your system's powerful. It's been trained on over 1.3 billion miles of AI with 200,000 high-risk driving events. How are you modeling that data if somebody's blinking their eyes or they're drowsy or they're just glancing down at the phone? How are you modeling that to know that it's accurate?
Yeah, that's really important. And actually, in the meantime, it's 3 billion miles, not 1.3 billion, because it keeps growing. We're learning from every driver, from every vehicle, and we look at the good drivers for the inspiration of what do you do that addresses a high-risk situation appropriately, right? We have some rock star drivers that have driven for 45 years without having a collision. Imagine that, 45 years daily commercial driving, 8 hours a day, and you've never had a collision. That's some pretty damn good driving. And so we look at what they do, what they pay attention to, how they respond to different risks coming up. And of course, we look at the seconds that lead up to collisions for some of the drivers that are not so good yet. And then we look at those risk factors. And as you said, every collision or every near miss, we see about 6 near misses for every collision. We go back and look at the preceding moments and say, what was the driver doing? What was the road situation? And we look at how close were you? How fast were you going? What were the road conditions? What were you looking at? What were you holding in your hand? And that's how we assess. And we are very rigorous using statistics and deep learning to basically learn out of the data which are the highest risk factors. What you find, most collisions are not just a single risk, right? It's not, oh, you hit the brakes and then something bad happened. It's there was a heavy traffic jam, the roads were wet, you didn't pay attention for a moment, the lead vehicle braked, then you hit the brakes and you swerved, but you lost control. So these things come together. And we're basically looking at, okay, what's the thing we can get you to change that will most stop that combination of risks and that causality chain that leads to a collision? And that's really the secret sauce. You don't want to make it complicated. You want to make it really simple. Hey, pull over to use your phone, get your eyes back on the road, leave more following distance, right? Give you one thing that you can do right now to drop your collision risk.
Following distance is a big deal. When I lived in California, you see individuals on the Santa Monica freeway, they're literally 12 inches off of your bumper. And if there was an incident in front of you, you had to slam your brakes on, they're going through your trunk. People have, when I grew up, okay, 1 car length, 2 car lengths. So I'm the old guy there that leaves 3 or 4 car lengths. But then this in California, somebody zooms right in, so I've got to zoom back again. But it's that safer driving habit. Is that something that your system's looking for when you learn from those professional drivers that have been driving for 45 years with no crashes?
Yes, it is. And you're right. You're supposed to leave at least 3 car lengths. Technically, at highway speeds, you're supposed to leave 3 seconds, which is a lot more than 3 car lengths. So it depends on your speed, because the faster you're going, the more braking distance you need. In reality, the best drivers, those rock stars who've driven for 40 years without having a collision, you'll see they actually leave 4 or 5 seconds of distance. So they leave a big gap. And that really helps them. It gives them an out if the worst case happens in front of them. But you're right, in California and many other states, a lot of drivers are driving closer than that. And what we've learned from real driving is you can be 3 seconds or even 2 seconds following distance. If you're highly attentive, you've got enough time to respond and to brake if they brake. Now, if they come to a dead stop, you're going to be in trouble, even with 2 seconds following distance, right? It's not enough braking distance. But usually it's the lead vehicle starts braking, and then how quickly do you brake? Where you get really dangerous is if you're tailgating and then also speeding and then start being distracted. Then you're going to not have enough time to respond. And as you said, you're going to be in the person's bumper. Or even worse, if it's a truck, you're going to be underneath, which is where some of the more serious injuries happen. So they really, really want to be careful tailgating large vehicles like that, because they have a lot more mass than you do, and that does not work in your favor if you have a collision.
It's an ouchy situation. It's probably the nicest way to say it there. Is your AI system measuring the driving distance in real time? And when you develop a system, okay, we prefer at, say, 60 miles an hour that you have 4 car lengths or 3 seconds or 6 seconds. Is your system looking into that to help ensure the most important amount of safety that driver can have?
Yeah, we look at your speed. We look at your attention. We look at the posted speed limit. And then we measure visually, we measure the distance of the vehicle ahead, and we factor all of that in. And so if you're paying attention, we let you get a little closer to your point about typical California driving than if you're not paying attention. The distance we require does vary with the speed. So if you're going faster, you need to leave a more following distance. And again, similar to the distraction, you'll get a little nudge first just to leave more following distance. If you continue to tailgate, particularly if you're under 1 second, you'll get a more aggressive feedback that basically says you have to leave more following distance. We're looking again for that driver to self-correct. A lot of times, like you said, somebody cuts in and you're temporarily really close. As long as you start backing off gradually, we're fine. That's the appropriate behavior in that response. And we won't penalize you because somebody else made a mistake and cut in tightly. The other thing that's really important that we haven't talked about is the accuracy of all of these interventions is really important. There's nothing as upsetting as telling you, hey, there's a bicycle here and there's no bicycle, right? Or you're tailgating and there's nobody in front of you. So we spend years making sure all of our detectors, all of our interventions are super accurate, and to really only give you an intervention if we know it's not something you caused, but it is dangerous and it's something that you can fix.
Thank you for highlighting that, because to me, that you're building trust. It's not the false alarms or false flag. Okay, beep, beep, beep. Oh, this system stinks, and you're going to find somebody's going to get a YouTube video and learns how to turn it off without dispatch knowing. But if your system's accurate, they're not going to do that because they're going to see the positivity in that. Is that one of the key foundations going forward to ensure the system is accurate as possible?
The principle we're operating on is that the drivers have to love or embrace the system. That's really hard. That's a really high bar. And if you look at a lot of the traditional safety technologies, they don't meet that bar. If you look at lane departure warning, very common feature on newer, higher end cars, it has about a half false positive rate. So half the time it's giving you a warning, even though your tire just touched the lane markings in the center of a turn, right, when you're getting close. Or the lane splits from 1 into 2 lanes. I have this on my Tesla, unfortunately. And it gives you an alert for a lane departure warning, even though it's like, well, it went from 1 lane to 2 lane. And so, the lane marking was in the middle ahead of me. Those are super annoying to drivers. And what you see, if you look at the Insurance Highway Safety Institute data, over half the people who have those systems on their car disabled them. And of course, the value of a safety system that you've disabled is zero, right? It's not adding anything to you. That's an example of what's out there. The other example that's out there that almost all fleets have today is telematics, which counts hard braking. But if you look at hard braking, first of all, it's a very rough proxy for risk. It really reflects more. Are you driving in a big city? Are you driving at rush hour? You're going to hard brake more if you're driving in a crowded traffic environment. And it's a reflection of where and when you're driving, not of how good a driver you are. And drivers hate that, right? They hate being dinged. Hey, you put me on this route at 8 a.m. in the morning. It's not my fault that I'm having to brake. It's all these other people cutting in and pedestrians jaywalking that are causing me to hard brake. So we're very careful not to actually ding you for these hard braking instances where it wasn't your fault. And we score every driver, so you get a feedback score from 0 to 100. And a lot of your score deductions are for things that are entirely under your control. Like, are you looking down at your phone? Are you eating food with one hand while you're driving? All really dangerous maneuvers. So the accuracy is incredibly important and a big focus for us. If you have more than a handful of false positives, the drivers will, to your point earlier, will stop trusting the system, will start hating it, and it can get so bad that they start hitting the system, tampering. You don't want to go there. We are very careful. We measure that. We look for the hand wave or the smile or the nod, and you can see when the driver's grateful for getting that alert. All you need is a few of those moments where it saved your life and you become a fan.
And you become an advocate and you talk about it. A lot of deliveries take place in dense urban environments or neighborhoods where there's children playing, and then in those neighborhoods, every neighborhood has it, stop signs. And a lot of individuals, for whatever reason, don't stop at a stop sign. They come to a very, say, 5 miles an hour. Okay, and they roll right through. Is the NATO system monitoring for the rolling stop signs, for example?
We actually look for the worst behavior is blowing the stop sign entirely, so never slowing down. And that we actually warn you even before you get to the stop sign, because if warning you after is actually too late, right? So if you're approaching a stop sign at 35 miles per hour and you're not starting to slow down, we will actually say stop sign ahead and warn you to stop. The behavior you mentioned is a little bit better. You slow down and you don't quite come to a full legal stop and you keep driving. If you look at the data, it's actually quite interesting. I researched this. There's some great studies done on how people handle stop signs. And it turns out only 10% of drivers do what you learn at during your driver's ed course. The DMV says you need to come to a full, complete stop 4 feet before the stop line. That's what you're supposed to do. Only 10% of drivers do that. But 70% of drivers do some gentle version of a rolling stop. And it turns out that a rolling stop, if you look both ways and you're paying attention, so you've seen the stop sign, you have slowed down, you look both ways, you've cleared the intersection is what the safety programs call it, and made sure there's nobody there, and then you proceed to roll. That's actually not a bad technique. As long as you're attentive in that situation, you can be very safe. I want to be clear, it's not legal, right? The cop can still pull you over, but most people actually do stop signs that way. The worst example is what I mentioned earlier. You blow at full speed through a stop sign, which usually is because you're distracted, you're not paying attention, or you didn't see the stop sign at all. The other thing we see is people don't realize it's a two-way stop. And two-way stops are substantially more dangerous than four-way stops because the other person has the right of way, right? So you miss a car on a two-way stop. I happen to live near an intersection here in Palo Alto that has a two-way stop that's at the end of a series of 6 four-way stops. So almost no driver realized, oh, wait a minute, this is a two-way. And about 8 times a day, you hear some really upset driver honking because the person blew the two-way stop because they don't realize it's changed after so many four-way stops.
But that comes down to an architectural engineering design aspect where the city of Palo Alto should maybe perhaps consider redesigning that just because based on historical behavior, saying 8 times a day, you multiply that across multiple years, you've got a potential incident happening there. Your system, as I said earlier, is clearly saving lives. You're making a professional driver a better professional driver, and you're catching the attention of industry. You're commercializing your product, which I think is fantastic. You got a big investment recently from Stellantis Ventures. They invested in NAUTO. And later this summer, a NAUTO solution will be available in Stellantis commercial vehicles in the United States. That's impressive. Well done on that, Stefan. What is that integration going to look like? Will the NAUTO solution come directly from the factory? Will it be an aftermarket solution? What will that look like?
It's going to happen over several stages. The first step, which is imminent here, is you'll be able to buy your NAUTO solution directly from Stellantis and order it through them with your new vehicle. Where we head next is you'll be able to integrate your Stellantis telematics data and your NAUTO data into one set of dashboards and metrics. And then ultimately, the NAUTO hardware will go away and it'll be NAUTO software running inside the vehicle using the onboard sensors, your radar, cameras, ultrasonic sensors, GPS that's already on board the vehicle. Essentially, installation will be eliminated because you're getting the NAUTO system with your vehicle. And then over time, any extra hardware will be eliminated and you're really just operating it as a service embedded into the vehicle.
When you go software as a service, now you're getting interesting. Let's just say my daughter's a teenager now. I'm going to pay you a monthly fee because I want this to work there. Today, you're focused on commercial fleet applications. Will you eventually go into consumer vehicles there? Because every day they're still children, are getting a learner's permit or they're getting their driver's license from the DMV, and it's, holy cow, please don't wait and make that phone call happen. Please pay attention. Oh, I got to text my buddy. Oh, I got to text this. I got to do this. This is cool. I have freedom. Oh, no. When we started driving, we didn't have cell phones. So can your system eventually go into passenger cars?
That is exactly the dream. That has been the goal for a long time. So today, as you said, we're commercial vehicles only. But in that built-in version, there's no reason not to have it in vehicles that any consumer, particularly teens, are driving. With one of the things that's exciting about this Stellantis partnership, we're going into vehicles that also are sold to consumers, right? The Ram pickups and vans. And so you're starting to go into vehicle types that are available commercially for consumer drivers. And once we're integrated in those vehicles, you can do exactly what you just said. You have a teenager in your family, they just got their learner's permit. Well, let me add that subscription for the safety service. They're going to get a lot better. We can make a driver from an average driver to a great driver in just a couple of weeks. And unfortunately, for most teenagers, that process takes 2.5 years statistically. And statistically, the teenager will have 2.8 collisions in that time frame before they, quote unquote, learn to drive like an adult. So it's a scary period for every parent, and certainly something that we want to help prevent. By the way, the same thing is true at the other end of the age spectrum. Once you reach about age 72, you start getting worse. Men get worse than women do because they're overconfident. If you have an aging parent, again, it's a solution that you want to enable in their vehicle to allow them to keep driving and have that independence while also staying safe.
You give them the independence, so it's very good for their mental health, and you as the child, you're happy, and I'm assuming you can know their location. And so if they're lost, you can help them or send the services. So that's really, really good there. There's just so many opportunities of where your technology can go, especially as you enable software and you're catching the attention. So you have the Stellantis relationship, which is very, very interesting. And then you also have one with GM's BrightDrop. BrightDrop's been on the podcast and they're scaling faster than anybody thought they would scale. The way that Travis is doing running that is just absolutely fantastically well done. What does the partnership with BrightDrop look like? Is it similar to the Stellantis partnership where you're going to scale together and eventually get to software, or what is the partnership?
Very similar integration path. The big difference is with BrightDrop, we're already shipping. You can actually see BrightDrop vehicles on the road today with NAUTO in them. But same idea, you can order your BrightDrop directly from the factory with NAUTO equipped. It basically becomes a small checkbox add-on when you place your order. Ultimately, you'll have a single dashboard that shows you all the EV performance data, the range, as well as all the safety data from your vehicle. Over the next couple of years, we're working with them to be fully integrated. So you don't need a hardware box anymore. It'll just come as software in your vehicle. Those are commercial vehicles. So my guess is most people will want that capability turned on from day one. Unlike when we're talking about a pickup, where if it's sold to a consumer, you may or may not want the capability to monitor your driving and to give you feedback. Although, as you said, we've seen some people who, they have a collision and they say, actually, I wish I had that on. So it's an interesting opportunity for people to experience it and decide whether they want to have it as a permanent safety functionality.
If a consumer today listening to this podcast is curious, and can they buy one today and put it in their own personally owned vehicle, or is it only will sell the fleets today?
It's only fleets today, although we have a couple fleets that consumer type drivers drive. We're in some of the ride-sharing fleets. We're in some taxi fleets. So if you want to sign up to drive for a ride-sharing company or for a taxi company, you get to try it out that way. The other way you can, of course, is you can ride in a vehicle like that and see it in action. One of the highest density of NAUTO devices is in Las Vegas. So if you ride a taxi or ride-sharing in Las Vegas, it's a pretty good opportunity to see NAUTO in action.
So if you're in Vegas, besides gambling and eating really great food, look for a NAUTO system in the vehicle when you're driving around this trip. BrightDrop vans are all electric. Stellantis has made a very public announcement that they're going all electric with their commercial vehicles. What type of power consumption does your system take? Is it having any impact on range, any impact on performance? Or are you running a very lightweight compute, light power draw?
It has no impact on range. It's really a very light power draw. That's really the secret sauce here. How do you run highly complex, sophisticated AI in the vehicle in real time on a relatively lightweight compute platform? The processors that we operate on are the same ones that are in your iPad or in your iPhone, that grade of processor. It draws a few watts compared to the driving that you're doing and what the engine and the drivetrain's consuming. It's really rounding error, fractions of a percent. And we've been very careful to engineer our solution to be very efficient. Best example is if you park your vehicle, we monitor right after you've parked because things can still happen as you're getting in and out or other people park next to you. And then we go into progressive sleep states. So if you've parked for an hour, we're still monitoring during a lunch break, for example, that your vehicle's not getting hit while parked. And then as you park overnight, it goes into a deep sleep state to conserve battery. Because some fleets park their vehicles for 30, 40 days at a time, and you want to make sure you're not draining the battery during that time. So again, during your actual driving operation, it has very, very minimal impact on power consumption. If you're parked, it has no impact on your power consumption. It goes into sleep.
So you thought the power consumption through, which is a very big deal these days. The other aspect I think a lot about when I look at your system is insurance. Is there any impact on the insurance premium where the insurance company say, okay, the underwriter in this case can see all this data that look at the driver performance. Let's say this driver was not very good. He had a 60 to 70 score. He used your system, say 6 months. All suddenly now he's an 80 to 90. That's a different risk that you're insuring.
Yes, absolutely. So again, we're in commercial fleets today. We're helping those fleets substantially save on their insurance. Typically, you can get a 10, 15% discount right off the bat. And then as we make your fleet better, you can get substantial savings beyond that. Some of the large fleets we're working with are self-insured. So if you have more than a couple thousand vehicles, you typically have your own in-house insurance entity that bears that risk. And so there, all of the savings drop immediately to the bottom line. Typically for those fleets, we get you payback on your investment in NAUTO in about 4 or 5 months. It's really, really fast, substantially less than a year. If you're insured by a regular insurance company, we can get you enough discount up front that'll pay for hardware installation and the first couple months of service. And then we'll work with you. Typically under a commercial policy, you can get a rebate at the end of the year to get you additional savings. That's also possible. In the consumer world, you can typically get 5 or 10% discount for one of these telematics offerings. Those don't really make you a better driver. They just help identify who's a good driver already. We can come on top of that and actually make those drivers better. We've analyzed this score range from 0 to 100. If you're down in the 20, 30 range at the low end of the score, you're about 4 to 5 times riskier than the driver who's at a 90 score. In the end, you should be really paying 4 times less for your insurance once you get above a 90 score. Doesn't quite work that way today. Insurance companies aren't giving you such aggressive discounts, but you can get quite a strong discount today.
If you can get a strong discount, then you're financially motivated to become a better driver. You're going to save lives. It's a win-win for everything there. You mentioned earlier that you focused on NAUTO because of with autonomy, there's still a long way to go, especially when you get to the last 3-4% of their automation is coming into vehicles. Your Tesla has autopilot, some have FSD. My vehicle has lane keep assist, some version of highway driving. Do we get to a point where driver monitoring becomes mandatory in these SAE level 2 and level 3 vehicles because the drivers, besides the having to move the wheel, they tend to get more distracted because the vehicle is doing more of the driving?
As you mentioned, the SAE level 2 and 3, so those are vehicles where it drives autonomously some of the time, but may have to return control to the driver. I think in those kinds of vehicles, it's essential to understand what the driver's doing and not doing, whether they're paying attention. There's a great Stanford research study that basically says if you've been reading a book or looking at your phone and you haven't been paying attention, and suddenly the vehicle wants to hand control back to you, you are worse than a drunk driver in that first minute because you have no context, no orientation, you don't know what's going on. And even though you may be a fantastic driver normally, you're not paying attention up until that moment of transition. So I think that's absolutely essential. Europe already requires that. I think the US will as well. I think that's coming. Now, that's different from the level 4 or 5 systems, which are meant to drive autonomously all the time and never hand control back to you. There, obviously, there's no driver anymore at all. No one's ever driving. But what we found, interestingly, is particularly in the kind of robotaxi use case, you still will want some kind of occupancy detection to make sure who's in the vehicle, are they safe. You don't want the vehicle to brake hard for something that's happening out ahead on the road if the person is not wearing their seatbelt and doing some kind of gymnastics in the vehicle, right? And so even then, the vehicle needs to be aware of, is there somebody in the vehicle? Who's in the vehicle? What are they doing? And are they properly, in their seat? So those scenarios of we're all going to relax and fall asleep are probably fine. But I'm worried about the scenarios of people playing games and being oriented differently in the vehicle. And that could lead to some really nasty injuries if you're not aware of that as the autonomous car.
You have to be aware because it just takes one TikTok or Instagram trend to go viral. Somebody doing something, I'll say very frankly, stupid in the vehicle. Everybody wants to mimic it because I got to get views. I got to get clicks. And it starts this mimicking train, which is not good. When we achieve full autonomy, robotaxis, let's say we're operating in 20, 30, 40, 50 cities around the United States, do you see the NAUTO system being used for occupants detection, or how do you see it being used in robotaxis?
First of all, robotaxis are one of the 2 areas I see where really you will have full level 4, level 5 autonomy. The other one is long-haul trucking. In both of those cases, beyond the safety use case, there's a second major incentive to have autonomous systems in those vehicles, which is you get a lot more use out of the same vehicle. For a truck in particular, today you can only drive 8 hours at a stretch under federal rules. You could extend that to almost 24/7. The vehicle will still need maintenance occasionally and recharge or fuel. So it's like, let's say 23 and a half hours per day. And that's a huge productivity boost. And so in those vehicles, we will mainly be the platform to learn about high-risk events and to make sure the occupants are safe if it's a robotaxi. The vast majority of our vehicles, though, are light commercial vehicles today, where the person in the vehicle isn't mainly a driver. And I think that's something a lot of people have forgotten when they think about autonomous vehicles. If you look at our fleets, it's a telecom installer, a utility lineman, a maintenance technician, some kind of salesperson, your package delivery guy that's bringing you packages. Those people have a primary job function that's actually not driving. And so they won't go away. That same productivity benefit isn't there because the person has to be in the vehicle anyway. They're going to be on your payroll as a technician. While maybe packages could be delivered at 3 a.m, Amazon has occasionally done that at my house, and I don't particularly love it because my security system detects that and beeps. But in particular, if you're talking about something like the cable guy or the phone guy, you don't want them working on your house at midnight or 3 a.m, right? So you're still going to be limited to business hours. There's not the same productivity benefit. And what's interesting is as our system has gotten better, we're getting dangerously close to the safety levels that are expected for autonomous vehicles. Our best fleets have gotten 80% reduction in collisions. And if you talk to most autonomous vehicle companies, they're saying, well, we can kind of reduce 94, 95% of collisions. So there's only a small 10, 15 point gap now that remains. And I think a lot of that can be closed over the next couple of years. So for a fleet that has a technician in it, it may not ever make sense to go autonomous. For a truck or a robo-taxi, it will, and NAUTO will be there as the safety system to make sure that the traffic patterns overall and the occupants are safe, but not necessarily helping a driver anymore since AI is driving at that point.
An 80% reduction in collisions is fantastic, impressive. Is the NAUTO system currently being used today on traditional long-haul trucking with professional drivers?
Yes, it is. In general, we're seeing about 2/3 reduction in collisions. There are a couple areas where we see slightly lower percentages, more like 50% reduction. One of those is the one you just asked about. If you have well-trained commercial drivers who have been with the fleet for a long time, very experienced, they start from a lower risk rate. So typically they will see about 50% extra reduction we can get. The other segment, interesting, is what we were talking about earlier, taxi drivers and ride-sharing drivers. They have no particular professional driver training, right? It's a consumer that shows up and drives commercially. And so we see that we can still dramatically improve those, but the reduction percentages are a little bit lower because there's no supervisor typically. They're distracted by using their app to accept rides and take passengers. So we still see huge reductions, well worth it, but not as big as in a package delivery or a service fleet where you really have very good drivers that learn quickly.
Either way, it's a positive step in the right direction. It's a very positive step. You've built really great AI that's saving lives, lowering insurance premiums, and having a positive benefit on society. In your opinion, what is the future of AI as it relates to mobility? You've got a broad view here.
Well, the way we build NAUTO really does express my philosophy on AI overall. AI should be deployed to help people, not to replace or harm people. AI has phenomenal potential. It's a great tool if deployed properly. It can make you more efficient, can make you smarter, can make you safer, can save you time, save you fuel, save you money, can automate finding routes for a trip, whether it's a personal trip, booking plane flights and hotels, for example. It can help you analyze data more reliably, right? So for a medical diagnosis, for example, great to have AI review all your history and say, oh, you might need this or this kind of treatment. Where things get, I think, more dangerous is if AI is replacing human judgment. We talk about that in the autonomous vehicle. You don't want to replace the human driver too early because the human driver has certain really powerful skills. Good human drivers are phenomenal. They're 10 times better than the average driver. So you don't want to replace them too early. If you talk about something like a medical domain, you don't want to replace that doctor judgment and their experience level. The AI can recommend and surface options, but shouldn't be the final decision maker. And coming back to mobility overall, the uncharted domain really is applying AI at the system level for transportation. So do you even need 3 trucks going into the same neighborhood when you could share 1 truck? A great efficiency improvement, right? When is it more efficient for you to go to a service and get something done or for that service to come to you? Another great question that AI can optimize. So for example, should you go to a dentist office or should the dentist be in a roving van that comes to your house? Which one is more efficient? Well, most people don't realize in the pandemic, we got huge savings in fuel and carbon emissions because everybody had their packages shipped to them as opposed to making all those grocery trips and shopping trips yourself. And essentially, the UPS or FedEx or Amazon van is a shared service, right? Lots of people's goods are all riding on the same truck. So it's actually quite an efficient model, assuming you order more than 1 toothbrush at a time, obviously, then it becomes wasteful. So there are opportunities there. The other thing we touched on briefly during this discussion, but I want to come back to, we do see that infrastructure has bottlenecks and has critical safety areas. Most of us intuitively know traffic jams happen in the same places all the time. If you're familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area hospital curve of 101 up in the city, it's pretty much always a traffic jam. What people don't see is the risk level of different locations, different intersections, different on-ramps and off-ramps can vary by a factor of 1,000. So you may have 2 exits off the same freeway, a few miles apart, and one of them is 1,000 times more dangerous than the other one. So that tells you 2 things. One is you'd want a navigation system that knows that. It says, okay, I'm going to avoid this particular exit, take you somewhere else. And we've modeled that for the Bay Area with 1 or 2 minutes deviation, you can cut your risk by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. So not quite a factor 1,000, but a factor 10 or a factor 100. But of course, the government should also have all this data and fix it, right? There's no reason for that 1,000 times riskier intersection to stay that way. And in most cases, it's pretty easy to know what's the cause, right? You're coming down an off-ramp at 65 miles per hour and you end in a traffic light that's mostly red. Well, that's really bad design. You don't want that kind of situation. Those all come to light in our data. We actually do great risk heat maps, essentially, of the whole country and then dive deep into cities. And we're quite happy to share that data with the relevant infrastructure DOTs so they can fix it. It's all anonymized, to be clear. Nobody knows who drove where, but it's the collective risk that has been experienced by all the hundreds of fleets that we're in. And it's very useful if you want to go figure out how to prioritize your highway dollars to fix the biggest problems.
We have to upgrade the infrastructure, especially as we go to SAE Level 4. Autonomy, Torque hosted me a while back out in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Some of that infrastructure out there, the way it's designed, it's not very good. It's probably the nicest thing I could say. Frankly, some of the stuff is dangerous, and that's what Peter von Schmidt told me they're testing out there because of the infrastructure. But if an architectural engineering firm, a DOT, a state agency could look at your data and say, hey, wait a second, we can make a positive impact on the residents of the state, the residents of this community. That's a win. That's part of their job as the government, is to make a really great society from what they're doing, especially from an infrastructure standpoint. So thank you for highlighting that. Stefan, this has been a really insightful, frankly, awesome conversation. As we look to wrap up this conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
2 things. First, really try to stay safe out there when you're driving. And if I had to give you some simple rules of thumb, number 1 thing is when you're driving, just focus on driving. There's a great billboard up on Long Highway 101 here that I saw yesterday that says, if you're texting, who's driving? And I think that's really true. Like you need to focus on the driving task. It is the most dangerous thing you do every day. For anybody who's not a young child or really elderly, it is your top health risk, actually, is driving. The simplest thing you can do to make sure you stay safe is to stay focused on the driving. The second thing is, if you want to time your trips, drive off-peak if you have that flexibility. Because driving risk spikes at rush hour. It spikes on Friday and Saturday night when people go partying and there's drunk drivers on the road. So if you can avoid those driving hours or avoid some of the most congested spots, that's a really practical lesson too. That's for driving specifically. The second thing I'd love for people to think about is all our conversation the last hour or so is really an example of using AI well. And we're going to see a lot more discussion about the policies, regulations, applications of AI. ChatGPT has made it so popular as a personal agent and chat partner. And so thinking through what are great uses, if it's helping you book a trip or helping you research a particular topic, wonderful. It's a wonderful tool. If it's helping you cheat on a test, one that's very currently in the news, or if it's helping you design something dangerous, then that's not such a great use. How do we make sure as a society, this technology is like the wheel or like the steam engine. It has many, many thousands of uses. And we need to make sure we put it to good use rather than to destructive uses.
We have to use AI responsibly. That's the bottom line. I love the line, if you were texting, who is driving? So next time you're driving and you're texting, remember, if you are texting, who is driving? It's not you. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is NATO. Stefan, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed in the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices, LLC, to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.